Good morning, participants. Welcome back from the break. My name is Jennifer DeGrees, and I'm an eye care prevention specialist. And today we also have Lori Anderson, who is also an eye care prevention specialist. She will be monitoring the chat. So, any questions or comments that she would like to make, please put it in there, and she will monitor that and get it to our presenters, which I would like to introduce to you at this moment. We have Dr. Brandy Conrad, and we also have Dr. Johanna Bailey. Dr. Brandy Conrad is an assistant professor of professional practice in the School of Social Work and is the coordinator of the social work practice and school specialization. Dr. Conrad is a qualified school social worker and has practiced as a school based social worker and supervisor since 2006. Dr. Johanna Bailey currently serves on the board of directors for the American Council of School Social Workers and the Thrive Foundation. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Brandy Conrad and Dr. Johanna Bailey.
Thank you so much. We are very excited to be here. Dr. Bailey and I love to talk about school social work and trauma-informed schools. Our paths are very similar. We met after Hurricane Katrina, and we have just kind of been side by side doing a lot of things since then. We've both practiced in the schools since 2005, 2006. As a school-based social worker as well as a supervisor. And then we are also both teaching at LSU in the School of Social Work. And Dr. Bailey is the BSW director. So she's able to see all of our new students coming in that are interested in getting their bachelor's degree in social work. We're also on the board of the American Council of School Social Workers. And that is a national board for school social workers that we're doing a lot of great things, as well as working on a couple of grants to increase the number of school social workers in the state. So we're very excited to be here. We were just talking about how we usually talk for 3 hours. And so we're on a 1 hour time crunch right now. So we know that we will not get to all of the slides in the presentation, but if you are interested in receiving the presentation, we can send you that link. We'll give you our email address at the end, or we can put it in the chat so that you have access to this, because we most definitely are not going to finish it all of the way. So we'll go ahead and get started. I first like to share a story. And every time I talk about trauma-informed schools, I always share the same story. So if you've been in any of our presentations, you probably have heard this story before, but it goes back to one of the most memorable kids that I've ever worked with. He was a second grade boy that was on the verge of being expelled. And so he was constantly running out of the classroom and sometimes even off of campus, hitting and kicking teachers and his peers, and would destroy the classroom on almost a regular basis. So he was also very difficult to build rapport with, and the teachers and school administration would often breathe a sigh of relief when he would be absent from school, because the school would be able to function better and we would not have to go on lockdown every day or evacuate his classroom. And then halfway through the year, after I was working with the student and one of the other social workers was working with the student. The student came to school with a very large mark on his arm. And when asked what happened, the student began to cry. So we knew something was going on. A child protection report was made. And then the next few days, the student became absent from school. We tried to contact the parent. The mom's phone continued to go unanswered, and then eventually was saying it was not accepting calls at all. And so we were very worried as a school, because this student usually is never absent from school, and this had been about a week. So almost a week later, the aunt of the student came to the school to let us know that the student was no longer enrolled, and that he would be moving to another state to live with his father. And so according to the aunt, she gave us a little bit of information that when child protection was involved, the child had disclosed severe physical and sexual abuse by the mother's boyfriend. And so we kind of understood or knew something was going on, but we didn't know exactly what. All we knew or understood were the behaviors that we were seeing. And so I often think about this student, and especially when I work with other students that are exhibiting some of those same behaviors. And this quote from Annette Bro comes to mind every single time that I'm talking in an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, or when we're in a FUBA meeting and we're trying to figure out what this behavior plan needs to look like. And it's from Annette Bro, and it says 9 times out of 10, the story behind the misbehavior won't make you angry, it will break your heart. And so I'm sure that you can all think of students right now that kind of come to mind, that stand out, that really resonate with you, and that you will never forget. And this is really the premise of our presentation, is to understand the background and the foundation that trauma has on a lot of these behaviors that we see in our students. So what we're going to do today, by the end of this workshop, you will be able to have an increased understanding of key components of a trauma-informed school. We're going to review roles of school administration, teachers, and parents in trauma-informed schools. And we're also going to learn how to implement trauma-informed practices in the school setting. We probably will not get to all that again, like I said, because we only have an hour to talk, but I do want you just to kind of understand and understand the research and the information that Dr. Bailey and I have gathered. When we're looking at research, on average, every classroom has at least one student that's been affected by trauma. And the statistics are showing that close to 40% of students in the United States have been exposed to some form of traumatic stress in their lives, with sexual assault, physical assault, and domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence. Those are the top 3, the most prevalent that we are seeing in the research of students in trauma. But when we look at Louisiana, we can also add natural disasters. So that is something that we are experiencing too. And so the new and upcoming research that we're looking at also talks about civil unrest. That is starting to become very prevalent with children in trauma. And so when you're looking at what students are experiencing and the trauma that they're in, usually it's, at their environment, at their home. And so for some students, school is the only place in their lives where they know that they can feel safe, or that they have some kind of form of a stable relationship. And for many of our students who are affected by trauma, having the difficulty with engaging in school, they may come to school with the best of intentions. They're hoping to form those meaningful relationships. They're hoping to feel connected to teachers and feeling connected to their peers and to have that academic success. But what we're often seeing is that trauma is manifested into defiant, demanding, and disengaged behaviors, and they're unable to learn, and may even be confused about why they can't relate and bond with other students. So this is really what we want to kind of talk about today with you. And the chat is open. So if you have any questions, please just write it in the chat. I can't see the chat, so Dr. Bailey will kind of read those out as needed. But if you do have anything that you want to share, we would love to hear from you, because it's not just us standing here or sitting here on this screen giving you information. We want to learn from you too. You are in, a lot of you are in the trenches, you're at the schools, and so everyone's experience is different. So if you have anything that you want to share, please just stop us and let us know. So we're going to look at some statistics. We briefly touched base just a couple seconds ago on the average that every classroom has at least one student that's experienced trauma. So I'm going to just provide you with some more statistics to give you a well-rounded understanding of what that looks like in our schools. But students that have or experienced trauma are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade and score lower on standardized assessments. Sometimes it's difficult for schools to understand the importance of mental health with these statistics, and we're hoping to see the importance of having school mental health providers on staff. We have seen an increase since COVID, especially with COVID funds, that some schools and districts, LEAs, are hiring mental health providers, which is our hope and our goal. NASW is our National Association of School Social Workers, and they actually recommend that there be one social worker for every 250 regular ed students and one social worker for every 50 students with exceptionalities. And our schools in Louisiana do not have that. We're not following this recommendation at all. In fact, there are many schools that have security officers and have no social workers or mental health providers on staff. And so again, we come back to this research because that's what Dr. Bailey and I, we love to do a lot of the research for school mental health. A lot of schools are showing that they have those security officers, and mental health providers are are very, very rare, and the impact that it has on students. So that's something that we're trying to change, and to increase the number of school social workers and mental health providers in our schools. Students with trauma history also experience more receptive and expressive language difficulties that result in poor relationships with peers and adults. And we can see that whenever we have a student who comes in and just has that difficulty just with everything, academic, social, emotional, peer relationship, everything is just impacted. And so, like, as I mentioned before, in these instances, it's sometimes difficult for our teachers to form relationship with these students. And so that's where Annette's quote kind of comes in to play when we're having those conversations about how can we really meet the needs of these students who've experienced trauma. And as professionals, Dr. Bailey and I, we always talk about whenever we're doing CEUs and supervision with our social workers that we always try to rule out trauma when we're assessing those defiant behaviors because it's so important. And then again, we know this, and we probably can attest to this too, that students who have experienced trauma, they're also suspended and expelled more often, and they're more likely to receive special education services. So this is why it's so important for schools to be trauma informed. And we'll briefly talk about schools and reevaluating their discipline policies. Hopefully, if we can get to that part of it, of the slides, but if not, it is here for you to view. And then we also have a video in the presentation that talks about kind of reevaluating those discipline policies.
So it is so hard for Dr. Conrad and I not to see your faces or be able to interact with you. We're used to seeing and interacting and breaking into groups, and so us just talking to you is does not really work for us. So so much of trauma work is connections that you make, and so I want to make sure that we're engaging with one another while we're on this presentation. We have no clue how many are on the presentation, can't even see that. So if you can in the chat, just say, just give your name and how many years you've been practicing, if you're a school social worker or a school counselor or a teacher, what your role is in the schools that you're in. And as that comes up, I don't know if y'all get to see the chat, but hopefully I will see them, and we can kind of get a feel for who's in the room, because so much of trauma work and making trauma informed schools is about the connections you made. Now, Jennifer from iCare said that something that Dr. Conrad mentioned earlier. She said the same issue with school counselors. There are not enough numbers per students. And so we're not only seeing this for school social workers, we're seeing this for school counselors and possibly a lot of school personnel. So again, I know I've asked y'all to put y'all years. Am I going to see that? I don't know if I'm going to see it or not. I hope y'all see it, but we just kind of want to make connections and see who's in the room and who's not, how many years we have in the room. So I don't know if I get to see it or not, but oh, it's coming.
So I can call them out too. So we have a after school program, Miss Monique, 18 years,
Oh,
school
okay.
counselor, a school counselor for 2 years, school social worker since 2014. They're coming in quick. More school counselors, 17 years, SEL specialist, 25 plus years, a crisis counselor, more working with inner city teacher working with families and teachers and communities, substance abuse counselor, more school social workers, school counselors, and they're ranging from anywhere from 2 years to 24 plus years.
Oh, so we have a lot of history. A lot of us who for our young social workers and school counselors and after school programs, those people who are here for 20 or plus years know that there is joy to the work they do because they are still here. So you will get through it. But again, like I said, a lot of what we do in trauma informed schools is the connections that you have to make. But before we get started on how school personnel and school social workers and teachers and school administrators can assist in trauma recovery, we want to give a brief overview of how traumatic events can impact our clients. It's very important to understand one of the key assessment techniques we use in trauma recovery is to understand the traumatic event and how it's perceived by the client or the student. And this information will help school counselors and school social workers better assist clients in the trauma recovery. So no, we're not saying to go out and assess every student for trauma. That's not what we're saying. But we need to understand how someone experiencing some type of form of trauma can impact them. And these are some of the areas that you want to consider when you're thinking about risk factors. And that is the severity of the event. So, according to the student, how serious the event was, how badly the child or someone was physically hurt. Did someone love go to the hospital, especially with COVID-19 and the pandemic? We're seeing a lot of loss, a lot of loss that wasn't expected, a lot of immediate loss, and no time to grieve for that or no time to prepare for that. Um, Someone says also disaster relief work. We're still trying to recover from Hurricane Ida. I know a lot of homes when I went to we had to take a shortcut through Lake through Laplace, and I did not realize how many homes were still not children and families were still not back in their homes because of the damage that was done from Hurricane Ida, which was about 5 months ago. So always when you're talking about Louisiana, disasters has to be a part of that. Um, were there police involved? Were the children separated from their caregivers? Like Dr. Conrad said, we did some work on Hurricane Katrina, and we talked about the children who were separated from caregivers versus the children who were not, and how they did and how they fared during after the post hurricane. Um, were they interviewed by a principal, a counselor? Did a family member die? So the severity of the event is definitely going to um, have a huge impact on the student and how the student may perceive it. It could be minor, it could be major. It really depends on the student and the situation. And they could have all these. They could have been displaced, lost a family member, and lost all of the items at one thing, which is going to be a little bit more severe for someone who just had to evacuate and maybe didn't know where a family member was. And so just understanding that severity of the event for the student is going to be very important. Um, then you want to talk about proximity to the event, like how close were the students to the event? So someone who just knows of someone who lost something or who had a family member that died, or were they involved? Like this happened to the child in their immediate family. And when you're working with children, especially children of color, family members and how they identify family members is much different. So it could be someone's aunt, but if that aunt was their primary caregiver, then that's going to be someone within their household. So we want to be careful of not putting traditional values on families and how households look. A lot of children live with their grandparents, and so if they lose a grandparent, it's not just a grandparent to them. If that grandparent was living in the home, that's not extended family, that's immediate family to them. So we just want to know, you want to keep in mind the proximity of the event to the student. Did they see it happen? Did they watch it on television? I don't remember how many of you remember where you were for 9/11. I remember watching the events unfold on TV. So no, I was not in New York. It did have an impact on me, but it's going to be a much different impact than someone who was actually in New York, who was actually out there by the Twin Towers, who had actually had to evacuate the Twin Towers. I know Dr. Conrad lost an cousin in not in the events of 9/11. And so she was not in New York, but she experienced a loss from the events that happened. You also want to think about caregivers' reactions, especially with students, because children feed off of their caregivers. And so, did the family member think that they were telling the truth, or that this impacted? Did they validate their concerns, or saying, well, you don't need to worry about that, you're not an adult? Like, how did the caregiver react to them? Did they take the child seriously? Did they not take the child seriously? Did they respond to their needs? Are they coping themselves? Are they in need of assistance? You also want to take into consideration prior history of trauma. Someone who has prior history of trauma is going to be at far greater risk than someone who just experienced trauma for the first time. And that's just because, prolonged exposure to events and traumatic events that develop over time can kind of develop some traumatic stress reactions. And so those students are going to be re-experiencing things over and over again. So someone who lost everything at Katrina and Hurricane Ida came, or the Great Flood of 2016 came, and you lost everything all over again. So you're re-exposed to the traumas and the events that you that you were exposed to. I have a friend who had lost majority of their things during the flood in 2016, and they had minor damage to their home for Hurricane Ida, and their home is getting fixed, and the child came in, and barely has any other issues or underlying issues in the family, but she came in and she said it smells like the flood, and smells like it did after a flood because her home is now getting fixed, and it triggered a reaction in her, and the mom wasn't expecting that, that the child was so young when the flood happened that she would this just the smell of something would trigger it. So remembering that. And then also thinking about family and community factors, the influence of culture, race, and ethnicity of children, the families in their communities can be a protective factor, meaning that children and families have qualities or resources that help buffer against the harmful effects of traumatic experiences in their aftermath. Culture often has a positive impact on how children and families and communities respond and recover and heal from traumatic experiences. So, if a community isn't doing well, then maybe it's going to be a lot harder for the children to recover in that particular area. So when we come and think about traumatic experiences and traumatic reactions, another important component in trauma recovery is to understand a client's stress response or a student's stress response. We all, as humans, have stress responses because it's fundamental to our survival, um, often derived from those biological responses to threats or perceived threats, and prepares our bodies to be fight, flight, or freeze. When we aren't able to fight or flight, we freeze and shut down. Students who experience multiple traumatic events have the stress response repeatedly, and it activates them, making them feel on high alert on all the times. So, this can explain why students who have experienced traumatic events are triggered by what can seem like trivial stressors in everyday life. So, again, the amount of exposure, the constant re-triggering of events can pose some sort of issues for a client or a student who has experienced traumatic experiences over and over again. Some examples of this would be the student being corrected for making a bad decision or having a disagreement with a peer. Children often have difficulty with fighting and fleeing, which is why we see a lot of more freezes, responses, and combinations. As you can see from the chart, here are some common responses when someone is in fight, flight, or freeze response. So when you have a student that's constantly crying or stomps and kicks or has feelings of rage, that's how they're experiencing and how they are being able to try to deal with what they're feeling, as opposed to someone who's restless and fidgety and has darting movements and things like that and can't keep still. So what appears to be maybe ADHD might be someone who's just very anxious and dealing with a lot of issues on the inside and cannot sit and focus and stay still. And then that whole withdrawn and freeze and feeling and heart pounding and sense of dread and feeling stuck. That's more that depressive symptoms. And you see they just can't get over it and they've been exposed to so much and they're withdrawn. So, just with that background information, it brings us to what we're here to talk about today. And that is kind of what are the principles of trauma informed care. Um, and so, when you talk about SAMHSA has come up with created 6 principles for trauma informed care. And as school personnel, we have to, and no matter what setting we are in, we need to use these principles to guide our practice. So, whether you are in an after school program, whether you are in the cafeteria, whether you are a principal or administrator, whether you are the counselor, anybody that's has a part of a school or is a part of a school, it's a whole culture that they're trying to create. And so the 6 principles include safety. When we talk about safety, we automatically assume that we are talking about, do we have enough police guards? Do we have enough video cameras? Are the doors locked? But sometimes when you talk about safety, it's not just about the physical nature of your environment. Also includes the social and emotional safety. So that classroom setting, do students feel heard and understood and that, being serviced and feel safe when they come into the doors? And that's not just physical safety, that's social and emotional safety. Do they feel validated? Are they comfortable? Are they met with respect? Also, that leads to the next one, trustworthiness and transparency. So anything that's conducted in the building is done so with stability and predictability. Consistency is one main thing that everybody has to go to school. Every child and experiences school in some type of nature. It's part of their social environment. It's one of the social environments that they spend a lot in. And so it needs to be very consistent for them to be able to build upon. So if you come in one day and it's this and the next day it's something else, especially with you see this with the pandemic and where the students are having anxious and anxiety because they don't know whether they're going in person or if they're going to be stuck at home. Like this inconsistency is not it's providing some issues for students because they don't know what the next day provides. Even my own children are concerned when they start seeing and hearing that someone has COVID in their classroom. Am I going to be put at home? Am I not going to be able to come back to school? They get worried because it's so inconsistent with all of the rules and regulations right now. And so it's affecting that part of their brain where they feel safe in the environment because they don't know what's coming next. And that consistency is very important for trauma-informed schools. Out of our control, out of our hands, because that's the area we're in, but that's kind of affecting some of the people, some of the way children are acting and interacting with their peers is because they are very nervous and they're very anxious when there's no consistency. The next thing is peer support and fostering student-student relationships. It's very important that students engage with one another, and peer support is a vehicle that fosters hope and safety and enhancing collaboration. And so you want to make sure that they have ability to engage and be peer supports for each other. That could be even educating and training specific age groups to be a peer support and peer mentor. Research shows that peer support is one of the main avenues to help children that's struggling at school, especially in our adolescent youth. So we also have collaboration and mutuality. So shared decision making. And so one of our grants, we are for Project Aware. We go in and we do observations of classrooms. And one of the better school environments that I've noticed is where children understand or students understand what's expected of them. So they come up with a group classroom rules, and they set and they know what the consequences are if certain things happen. And I did watch this. When people come in to observe, back in my day when I was in school, you had to be on your best behavior. Nowadays, they just act the way they want to act. And I was observing a classroom, and an incident happened, but it was handled very well because the student realized he got upset. He flipped the desk, but he knew to de-escalate, he needed to remove himself and go to the timeout room for the day. And so, without even disruption of the class, he knew that in that moment he made a choice that was not very good for the classroom, and he needed to excuse himself. And the way it was handled from the teacher, all she had to do was recognize, was that part of our agreement for our classroom rules, because it was listed on the board. They engaged in that conversation, and then he said he needs to make the decision to remove himself from the situation. So just that, the shared decision making in the beginning, not coming in as, this is the school, this is our school rules, and you're going to abide by them, but kind of being in a collaboration with, this is what we as a school to provide, you being part of the school for the students is what we need to do to make our school to be effective and safe environment for everyone. It works better with older adolescents when you have them with that decision making. So, late childhood, I wouldn't say pre-K and kindergarten will understand this concept so early, but maybe if you talk about rules and consequences, they might engage in a little bit in understanding of it. But the maturity level of a high school student versus a preschooler is going to be on a different level. So, make it age appropriate interaction for decision making, but also just make sure that every student knows that they're part of the classroom. Empowerment and giving voice and choice, and making sure that everyone feels heard and validated, and also cultural humility, understanding how culture impacts and the stereotypes and biases that we have.
So before we go any further, does anyone have any questions or comments or anything they want to share? We're at the halfway point. So I just wanted to touch base, but I can't see anything. So Johanna, you're gonna have to let me know.
I'm looking so far, no questions so far.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to move forward in talking a little bit about the trauma-informed teacher. And so these are some tips that school administration, school social workers, school counselors can assist teachers in becoming a trauma-informed teacher. And some of these are going to be very obvious, like, yes, this is what we should all be doing. But we understand how difficult it is to start and finish these tasks. We know how overwhelmed teachers are. We know how overwhelmed school counselors are and school staff are, just especially now with COVID and the strain that has been put on the education system and the homes. Everything is strained. And so we understand that these seem obvious, but there's a reasoning behind each of these different tasks. So the first one is for, and Dr. Bailey had said, like, for teachers to lay out their clear expectations, especially for students who have experienced trauma. It's very important that they develop a personal responsibility for their actions. So it's important for teachers to model and teach that appropriate expectation and those perimeters for their students instead of just announcing them. So a lot of times when we're talking when we're completing FUBAs and we're having those behavior plan meetings and we're talking, I always encourage students to come in because I don't want to make decisions for the student. I want the student to be an active participant. And that is a way for you to kind of have a buy-in too. So we often recommend allowing students to take part in some of the class rules and expectations and consequences. So if we're able to give students some of that power in saying, let's talk about what you think the school classroom or the school or classroom rules should be. That is another way for students and teachers to build that rapport and to form those relationships. And it can also decrease some classroom disruptions. Now, obviously we can't say if there's a school rule, no phones allowed in class. We talk about that a lot, especially with the adolescents. They're always asking why they can't bring their phone to class or why they can't bring their phones to school. So within the perimeters of, you are the ultimate boss of your classroom, but to be able to, some things that you can tweak on, or to be able to make some accommodations for, to be able to have those students take part in that process. The next is, of course, to form relationships. And it's so very important for teachers to attempt to build relationships with their students. As we mentioned previously, sometimes kids that have experienced trauma have a difficult time forming those relationships. But that shouldn't mean that the teacher or the school staff should just stop trying, but maybe to change their techniques and their ways of doing it. And the biggest component of this is to understand what each student's needs are and supporting that student. That's the way to help build rapport with that student. Now, we have many of times had different situations with our own students and clients that we've worked with that they just were not ready for counseling. They did not want to build rapport with anybody. And there's situations that you're not going to be able to do that with. And it's okay. And it's understandable that there's just going to be some kids that you aren't going to be able to reach. And it's important for our teachers to know, and for our school staff and everyone to know, if you tried and you did your best, that's what you can offer. The next is to harness the power of compromise. I've talked a little bit about that already, but I believe that the biggest takeaway that we've had with COVID with regards to the school experience is that teachers, school staff, even school counselors and mental health providers had to learn to compromise and be flexible with providing those services, whether it's teaching, counseling services. I still do some private practice on the side that's contracted with the school district to provide mental health counseling to students. And during the lockdown, we had to do that over we had to do teletherapy because that's just what we had to do to provide those services. So we know that as we're moving forward into more of an in-person instruction, we still have some of those days that we have to go virtual for whatever reason, that we just don't revert back to those old rigid practices that we were kind of stuck in before. I think there's been a lot of students that I've worked with that did remarkably well in the online environment. They suffer from social anxiety. They were constantly missing class for whatever reason. They were skipping, and the virtual option helped them to do their work. They were able to do a lot better academically, and we encourage parents to continue to let them do things outside of that, since they're not having a lot of that peer interaction. But as most of us probably have known, there were several students that just did not do well in the online on the online platform, and that's fine. But for us to kind of just look in that broader view of, okay, this works for some, this doesn't work for some, and just not to go back to that rigid practice that we had before COVID came about. Using humor, this often helps the students see teachers as real people. Humor can change a person's mood and assist in building that rapport and ease a tense situation. As also for allowing for redos. So kids who experience trauma, they can have waves of good days and bad days, like we all can have a good day or a bad day. But there may be some days that students are unable to cope with daily situations. And so to allow the student for that redo, to allow that student to be able to have a second chance at doing something or realizing that they need a break and allowing them to do it at a different time. But then also providing praise. But when we talk about praise, I've had teachers in the past say, well, I don't want to just praise them just for, sitting in their desk for 5 minutes because that's what they're supposed to do. And if the praise is not genuine, we don't want to make the students feel like we're pitying them or being disingenuine, but we want to be able to praise them for things like if they went an entire day without a meltdown, then that's what we can praise them for. And if they are allowed to do a redo, if they've just had a really bad day and they need to start over, to be able to communicate that with the student. Like, I understand that you're having a bad day. We're going to do a redo. I need you to, use your skills that you have learned in counseling, or that we're doing SEL, those skills. Let's use those skills. And when you're ready, let me know. And then also to validate their feelings. We have all been through a lot these last 2 years. And just to be able to validate those feelings. We're not suggesting that you provide counseling unless you are able to do so. We don't want just anyone kind of opening up that Pandora's box of trauma for a kid. So we're not recommending that you do counseling unless you are certified to do that. But if for teachers and school staff, just to be able to validate, I understand this is a hard day for you. That can go a long way in providing that support for students.
Dr. Conrad, we do have a comment from Miss Whitney. She said yes to number 6, and that culture is a very important component as well.
Yes, absolutely. Culture is a very important component. And we encourage the people that we do supervision for social workers, you have to have, ethics every year and things like that. But we encourage the social workers that we provide supervision for to attend a cultural competency CEU every year as well, because that is very important. Dr. Bailey and I did a presentation not too long ago with a group of grad students, and it was a really good presentation, and the students were very involved. They were very proactive in trying to figure out how we can address these deficits that we're having and that we see every day. And so we're hoping that the more cultural competency CEUs that are out there, that education will increase too. So that's definitely very important. Okay, so this is the cycle of trauma. When trauma causes that emotional or psychological damage to students, they may adopt a set of behaviors or patterns of thinking that put them on the path for further trauma. And you may have witnessed this with some of your students. So either directly through their own repeated actions, so if they are quicker to resort to violence, or as a result of consequences for their actions that do not fit within the societal rules and norms. So this would be like punitive measures after violating a school rule. We'd see that children can become more traumatized. They can re-traumatize. The situation can be re-traumatizing, and their problems are only compounded. We're not finding solutions. So if we're understanding the cycle of trauma, it's very important for us to keep that in mind, especially in the school environment where students may display problem behaviors related to past trauma. and then they become re-traumatized through punishment for those behaviors. So we're only embedding the trauma further and continuing the cycle of behavior problems rather than lessening them. And so you can see through this slide how the arrows kind of go, where you have that trauma, the kids are exposed, they're living that emotional and that psychological damage. That's what they're feeling, and then it results in behavior problems, which sometimes in the school setting will then end up being a punishment. And so then you're punishing the students for reacting to a traumatic event, to what their feelings, what they're going through, and then that also then turns into another traumatic event where it's being re-traumatized. So this is very important, especially if we're looking and creating the behavior plans, and you're looking at goals and objectives to see what we can do. Of course, you need a consequence for negative behavior, but is that consequence re-traumatizing the student?
Dr. Conrad, we do have a question from
Okay.
Ms. Whitney. She says, how can we break the cycle of trauma, but also hold the student accountable for his or her behavior?
So we get asked that a lot, actually, and that is a very good question, because when we talk to our students and we talk to the families about the expectations of school, there is an expectation that you have to follow. There are rules that you have to follow. A judge is not going to care that you were physically abused when you were 8 years old and now you're standing in front of a judge because you murdered someone. So we try to explain that we do have to have consequences, but without re-traumatizing the student. That's where we go into having them to be an active participant in those consequences. So in a moment when they are not agitated, when they have not been triggered, talk to them about what should your consequence be for whatever that is that they're working on. So let's say if it's elopement, if that student is one that just leaves the classroom often, in that behavior plan meeting, talk to them of what is a trigger. Let's figure out what the triggers are. And instead of running out of the classroom, what is something that you can do? And if running out of the classroom is going to be the consequence, what should that consequence, or is the behavior we're trying to avoid? What is the consequence that you're going to have for if you decide to leave the classroom? And so having them be in that active participation of knowing what the consequences are, they've come up with the rewards, they've come up with the consequences, helps it. By no means are we saying that there should be no consequences for students who have trauma, and we don't want to walk on eggshells around them, because we don't want to go back and pity them, or we want to show that empathy, but we don't want to show that sympathy. And so by having them part of that conversation and giving them some power over those decisions, that usually helps. Now, it's not going to be the case for all of them. And then you look at a lot of kids who've been, by the age of second or third grade, have had severe traumatic experiences. And sometimes, those conversations need to be had with the caregivers of what can we do? And then, of course, for the caregivers and parents to be on the same page, which is extremely hard. I think that's the hardest thing about working with students and families, is having the parents, sometimes they don't really want to be on the same page or can't be on the same page as what we'd like to see. But so that's really what our recommendation is just having that student be an active participant. Dr. Bailey, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you did. Made a really good points.
We do have a few comments.
Okay.
Ms. Gale said, so true. Mr. Leonard, very good point in reference to the judge in the courtroom. I tell educators that all the time. Ms. Teresa says, punishment versus discipline. Punishment is shaming and seeking control, versus discipline is teaching them why something is wrong and righting their wrongs in corresponding fashion.
Yeah.
Ms. Carter says, absolutely, we have to praise the small things. It motivates them to keep going and doing the right thing.
Yes. Those are all very good comments. Very good. Okay, well, this was a group activity that we have. We don't have that much time, so we'll keep it just kind of in the slides. So if you want the slides, y'all could have access to that. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit, and this one is very important. And when I first learned about this, I was kind of in shock, because I did not realize how to kind of see where some of our common classroom expectations and rules and activities can impact kids who've been exposed to trauma. And Megan DiMatteo did a great job. She has a great article on the common classroom triggers for trauma exposed students. And so I'm just going to briefly go over them since we only have about 15 more minutes left. But
Dr. Conrad, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt again. We
Yeah.
have a question.
Okay.
It says from Ms. Whitaker, how do you communicate with a child that's been through trauma whose only response with yes or no answers and is very withdrawn and likes to be by himself or herself?
Okay. So the very first thing that we learn in like when we're doing counseling is you have to kind of start where the client is. So we have to start where the student is. So if the student is not talking, is very withdrawn, we kind of have to start where they are. And this is one thing that I hate about when kids are really young and they can't make decisions for themselves and parents feel like they have to go to counseling to address things and the kids aren't ready. They're not ready to talk about things. They're not ready to process. They're not ready or they're not willing at that moment. Because my concern is that if we're forcing them, especially for counseling, if we're forcing them to participate in counseling and they're not ready and they're not wanting to, and they have this negative view of counseling when they're 14, 15 years old, when another situation comes up, because we all know how hard middle school is. Let's just say middle school in general, they're not going to want to participate because they had this horrible experience of being forced to participate in counseling when they're younger. So my recommendation, and just what seeing from those experiences, is if the student is not ready to talk about it, if the student is not ready to engage, all you can do is just let them be in control. That's usually the only thing that they have control over. That's the only thing that they have a say in is their behavior, what they're saying or what they're doing. They often don't have control over their feelings. They don't have control over their living situation. They don't have control over what happened to them. But if they're not ready to talk about it, then I just let them whenever they're ready. Provide them with the resources that you have. So let's say you have a school counselor or you have a school social worker or a school mental health provider, as long as they're understanding and knowing that these are the resources available whenever you're ready. And then trying to build rapport with them in a way that's not geared towards getting the information that they think that you're wanting to get from them. So involve if they're in really active into school sports, support them in that. Trying to find things that they enjoy, try to find things that they like. But I feel like if they're not ready to talk about it, if they're not ready to kind of engage in that, we don't want to rush them. Did that answer the question? I can't see the question. I'm sorry. So I'm just going off of what I heard.
So just to reiterate, that's when rapport is going to be very important. It's not so much about the trauma and what the child experienced. It's more so the relationship with the adult who's trying to work with them. So like Dr. Conrad said, just meeting the student where they are, the yes and no, they're not very verbal, but the more you make a connection with that student, the more they are going to want to process and open up and become, and it might take all year. It may take you thaw on the ice and the next year they vomit and tell the next teacher all this because they felt comfortable and they felt a connection to the school. So it's really about making those connections, building that rapport, and making it okay that it's just yes or no for right now, and just giving them the opportunity to share and not isolate them and say, okay, they're just going to say yes or no this time. So I don't know if that helps. How do you communicate with a child that's been through trauma whose only response? Okay, that was the question. So hopefully that helped you with the withdrawn. Like just make them feel as a part as the classroom or the school as you can.
Okay. Is any more?
Not at the moment. I don't see any more.
Okay. So we'll go back to these common classroom triggers for trauma exposed students. The first is rest time. So I was thinking, I was like, rest time is usually kind of peaceful and calm and quiet. But if you think about it, many students are comforted by the low lights and the sound machines and the cozy, snuggly sleeping pads and the thing on the floor and everybody, that's like a calming situation. But it could also be considered a fearful situation for a survivor of abuse. So a child who has been sexually abused, for example, may have a big stress reaction that goes into that fight, flight, or freeze response because it could trigger on this is what happened when I was being abused. This happens not because a student is choosing to act out, but rather is feeling overwhelmed. And so in this situation, talk with the teachers, talk with administration about making accommodations if that is necessary. Also, safety drills, safety lessons, and field trips. So we all know that we have had those safety fire drills, or an intruder drill or a bad weather drill in school, and they're meant to help prepare us for those unexpected emergencies. And especially like for field trips where students are going to the hospital or to a police station, and those things are considered educational and fun. But for a trauma survivor, these experiences might provide a front row seat to reliving their scariest memories. So if you think about a student who maybe has escaped a house fire, how they would react to the sound of a smoke alarm, or a student's potential that may have had police raids in their home or had negative experiences with the police. In a way, you could, for a hospital, if you had a field trip to a hospital, that could impact a student who maybe has had a family member who had a very terminal illness or had to go to a hospital to learn a family member has passed away. So there's all of these different situations and scenarios that we just need to be mindful of. And so one way could be talking to students about ahead of time about the emergency drills. Like, you don't have to say exactly we're gonna have an emergency drill today, and you can't always do that. But if you just say there's a possibility that we might have one this month, we haven't had one in a couple of weeks, or we haven't, so just be prepared. And if you get nervous or scared, let me know. I'm here. This is what we can do. Do you understand what to do during this drill? And having them just have a better explanation of what's going on. And then also, kind of instead of doing those field trips to those places, just having those conversations with administration about other alternatives as well. And then we see this a lot, the class assignments. These can be very tricky. So for example, if a student is asked to bring in a baby picture or complete a poster timeline with photos of their lives, although these assignments are meant with the best intentions, it can also be considered a trigger for students, especially students who've been adopted or who have been in foster care, or if they've lost all of their baby pictures and everything in the flood or a hurricane. So those things are very important to kind of think about. Is it, even though this is considered like an innocent family assignment, this can be very, very triggering to some students. So we can also talk about the situations that cause fear and shame, certain verbal and nonverbal communication. All of these things can be just triggers. There was one student that I worked with a while back, and this was when I was a supervisor, because the social worker that was providing the services looked like someone in their family that had physically abused them. So we have to just kind of be mindful of that too, that you may look like someone in their family that could have abused them in the past. So that could be a trigger as well. Not that there's anything that you did. It was just, we need to be mindful of those things. How much time do we have? We only have 6 more minutes. So I don't want to go too much further into these because then we'll never stop talking. But are there any questions or comments for these last 5 minutes that we have?
We do have a couple comments.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Nadia Ebanks said, I agree that building rapport and a strong relationship is very significant to getting that student to open up eventually. Joseph Patan says planting seeds, and Lynette Whitaker said yes, and thank you for answering her question.
Well, hey, Nadia, Mr. Joe.
And Mr. Joe, how are y'all?
We just really want to reiterate, it really does take a village to help these kids. And you know, even though Johanna and I have background, we're school social workers, and that's what's our passion in our hearts. We fully understand how important school counselors are. I think she's on, but my favorite school counselor has been Miss April Coleman from Twin Oaks Elementary. She is amazing. She has, I mean, just phenomenal work with students and families. And so when you have that good relationship with everyone, you're providing those students with that holistic approach. You're providing them with, you know, the social work standpoint, the school counselor standpoint, the teacher standpoint, the administration, nurse, everyone is just working together to try to meet the needs, but then also to support each other, because we understand how important self-care is and taking care of ourselves. I know that we kind of just count down every day until the next break. Usually that's, you know, how many days until Mardi Gras break, how many days until the teacher in service break. But to be able to provide a support for each other, because what you've experienced working in the schools has been traumatic. So it's not, you know, we were hoping that this wasn't going to last as long as it did. And it definitely proved us wrong, because we're still living it. And then we're still going to see this for years to come. Johanna and I have done a lot of research with Hurricane Katrina survivors, and that was in 2005 when that happened. And we are now in 2022, and we're still seeing the effects of Hurricane Katrina all these years later. So we know the impact of the pandemic is going to be long lasting, and we just make sure you're supporting each other as well.
So we do have a couple comments and questions.
Okay.
Whitney Delmore asks if you can share your email or contact so we can have the PowerPoint information. She'd love to share the information with her teachers and staff at her school.
Of course.
Ms. Vanessa Bowles says, we use restorative practices in our school. How do you deal with teachers that don't buy in or say this isn't my job?
Oh my gosh. Yes, that is all of the time. That's all the time. And restorative practice, there's a video in this slide, in the Prezi, that talks about restorative practice and restorative justice. And that's been the biggest barrier, I think, is the lack of buy-in from some teachers. So if you email me, we can definitely talk about that. Johanna and I love to talk. Like I said, we're already almost to our time, and there was probably about 10 more slides that we could have talked about. So if you ever want to just chat with us, we are happy to help. And then even to like put you through to different schools that have maybe done a really good job with restorative justice and restorative practice and how they had buy-in from their teachers. We can talk about that too. So is there a way, Johanna, you could write our email addresses in there?
I wrote it in, but I think it went in the private chat. So I don't know if the facilitators have to share it, but mine is easy. It's my full name at lsu.edu. So it should be easy to remember. It's Johanna, Jahanna, Bailey, Bailey at lsu.edu. And Dr. Conrad's is bconrad1 at lsu.edu. To go back to the question about the buy-in, again, in the beginning of the year and in the middle of the year, please try to have administrators, if the administrators buy in and they spend time on making sure that it's the village and that everyone is okay and on board on what y'all want to do and how y'all are going to do things, it usually helps when everybody is on board and you have people that are holding you accountable and in teams. And if you've been doing things the same way over and over again, why not try something new? Is what I tell people when they don't buy in. It's like, we've been doing this practice for a couple of years and it's not changed. And if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's insanity, right? So let's try something new. So before you say, no, that's not my job, or restorative practices, it's something I'm not going to do, why not try it? It may help. So I always try to give people pep talks. It's like, if what we're doing now doesn't work, let's try something else.
Hey, you are muted, ma'am. You are muted.
Okay, sorry. Everyone's just saying thank you for the great presentation and how great, amazing job you all did, which you did. So we'd like to thank you for presenting this wonderful information. And I think I speak for everybody else. I would love to hear the full presentation, the 3-hour long one. Participants, thank you for your comments and questions. Just a reminder, certificate questions. If you have any questions about certificates, you can reach out to Chandra DeLone at the iCare office, or you can call our office at 225-226-2273. Please don't forget to do your evaluation at the end of the session. They have to be done by 4:30 p.m. today. And always remember to reach out to iCare for any prevention and community needs. Would Dr. Conrad, Dr. Bailey, any final remarks?
Just thank y'all very much for attending.
Okay, yeah, and everyone says great information. Thank you so much. Y'all are awesome and fantastic information. Amazing job. It's all high praise. So thank you very much.
Thank
If
you.
no one has any more questions or comments, we'll be taking a break now for lunch from 11:45 to 12:30, and you can get into the next session at 12:30 p.m.